Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. We are here live in New Polity's August studio with the books that we've read. And we're excited to announce that it's that time of year again. We have another magazine, issue 4.3. A little late, but you know what they say, better late than never. It's a pretty good one, I think. And I'm here with Alex Denley, who we're trying to familiarize you guys with.
The man behind the podcast usually, but
yes.
Here now. So
yeah, we let him out of the doghouse every now and then to give us some wisdom. This magazine is a little slimmer than the last one. So if you're intimidated and if you thought, I really want to subscribe to the greatest magazine on earth, but I'm worried about being able to get through it, this one, great start, I think. Mm-hmm. It's less thematic, but I think if I had to point to something that's really connecting it all, it's the question of crime, criminals, sanctuary, intercession, and how to deal with a world that seems to be falling apart.
Yeah.
Fair?
Yeah, and you have, three accounts, really. It's Augustine, describing sanctuary, or what's a really weird concept to us. You've been researching it a lot more than me, but the idea of someone committing a crime and then running to the church.
Yeah.
Like putting their hands on the altar, this type of thing. And Augustine, in this is a letter, right? He's trying to defend the practice of sanctuary.
That's right. So he had a letter written to him, and as all these church fathers do, when they write letters, they're very aware that these letters are going to be circulated. And so it's written in a very pastoral mode. But this is a letter he writes to Macedonius, who says to him, Augustine is describing this letter, "You ask me why we say that it is part of our priestly responsibility to intercede on behalf of the guilty and to be offended if we do not get what we asked for, as if we do not get what pertains to our office. On this point, you say that you are deeply in doubt about whether this comes from our religion." And Augustine's letter is a work of convincing Macedonius that indeed this does come from our religion. So he doubles down. He doesn't back off from this very bold claim that it belongs to the priestly office to intercede for criminals, and that if you don't get the intercession you ask for from whoever's in pursuit of the criminal, whether someone seeking private personal vengeance or from state authorities, that you should be offended. That there's not just I think that's important. I don't just mean that, you kind of have a hissy fit. I mean that you understand that something politically improper has taken place when intercession is not given to criminals. That there's something owed to the office, to the way that the spiritual power and the temporal power function within society, that is not being granted to the spiritual office. Now, our age can be described in many ways, but one of the ways you could describe it is an age that cannot have or understand sanctuary, intercession for criminals. And that's what I wanted to open up the magazine with. And one of the methods we have at New Polity is just to say, okay, when we were trying to live as a Christian society, what did we do? And when you find something like sanctuary, when we grant criminals sanctuary because they get to a church, you have to ask, why did we do that, and why is it incomprehensible to us today? Because it does seem incomprehensible.
Yeah, no, I mean, and where would you go? I mean, you could go to the church, but then the police would just run to the church, and then you're,
Yeah, it takes a whole society. I mean, this is a very important point that often people can describe late antiquity and the Middle Ages as the church having some kind of hold over a nascent secular society. And so they can look at history and they can say, wow, the church is really, powerful, and it can even be complimenting it, or they can be insulting it, like the church shouldn't be that powerful. But the presumption is that there's this binary between church and state, there's this binary between the sacred and the secular, and the church is existing in its own sphere and operating down into the world. But even 10 seconds of thought about our own society shows that this is not the case. Like, if you live in a world in which the cops don't respect sanctuary, then you don't have sanctuary. Like it's a movement up and a movement down. It's the spiritual and the temporal agreeing actually on a common business. So when there's a famous instance that John Chrysostom went through, and John Chrysostom loved the rights of the church when it came to sanctuary. He was always using it as a example of mercy present in the world. I mean, the kind of mercy that you hope to have from fathers and mothers within the family is extended. And historically, for the first time, it becomes possible to receive mercy in this very broad, very efficacious way, just by going to a church and claiming sanctuary. There were things like it in the pagan era, but they weren't that widespread, and they were really specific to if a runaway slave, for instance, would grasp the feet of the statue of the emperor, then if his pursuers found him, I mean, they could take him back. He was still a slave, but they had to go easy on him. They couldn't kill him or punish him. Now, what sanctuary in late antiquity into the Middle Ages, what it entailed is if you made it to a church for mostly any crime, although as it develops, different countries have different crimes that you can't go to a church for sanctuary for, but you're saved from corporal punishment and including death. So you can't be killed if you get there. The priest, as Augustine points out, then becomes your mediator. And sometimes this was passed on to the deacon of the church, but there was a basic customary role where the priest would be the mediator between the offending party and those offended, and they would have to speak to him. Now, obviously, this is
like a defendant and lawyer or something.
Right. I mean, obviously, this is already a beautiful thought where the priest is doing something very Christological, right? He's standing before the wrath, as it were. And he is, even to the point that in certain medieval legends, there's this one that I remember where a saint is appearing to someone and wants them to build a monastery, and is basically warning them, because my body will be there, you're going to have criminals coming here all the time because it's going to be a holy place. And so, so it's not even like this is, priests were annoyed by their duty very often. I mean, history is rife with priests being like, another scumbag got into this church and I have to defend him. But they did understand that they had to defend him.
Right, okay.
Okay, why am I saying all this? Trying to give you some kind of context for Augustine here.
For why he's saying this. We're reading this, what? That was a thing? I remember when you were first telling me about it, I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing. Yeah. That you could run to the church, because it's, completely different today. And one thing I really like that Augustine said is, not only is it beneficial to the one who's seeking sanctuary, but it's also, what he'll say, is beneficial to the one who's seeking justice or vengeance, to make sure he doesn't go beyond and become vengeful. Yeah. And, sin by doing that. So you're starting to remedy the sin of the one who committed the crime by him repenting. Although it's not there completely. It's not like, okay, now you just didn't do anything.
No, in fact, Augustine in the same texts argues that there's something good about having harshness in law precisely when you have mercy available in sanctuary. And so in a way, it describes the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages can be a really big puzzle to moderns. It's what we have all fallen from in some way, and so we don't understand it. That the same age that is apparently home to egregious looking punishments, the dunking people and obviously beheadings and drownings. I mean, they just seem to take life not as seriously as we do in some ways. Is the same age that will let people off for getting to a place in time, and the same age where there's an expectation not just of justice, but that the wealthy will do charity to criminals. So one of the examples that I always think of is the stocks, right? Is a prototypical scandal to the modern mind. You have the medieval. I mean, this is how we understand the Middle Ages. We're like, well, there are people in the stocks getting tomatoes thrown
right.
at them, right?
Every Renaissance fair. Or
yeah, exactly. Which is, granted, good fun. And this is actually, to be clear, if you want to understand the Middle Ages, you just have to always remember that they were having fun. Like in punishment, in liturgy, in law, like these guys were having fun. And I think that's part of the scandal of the Middle Ages. We look at it and we're like, why is there a parade of people with jugglers and bears following someone who's about to have his head cut off or be hanged or something? And it's very hard to reconcile, and I'm not even defending them. I'm just saying that the kind of key to medieval Christendom is to understand that having fun was a sort of constant.
You just got to be having a good time.
They really were.
You're going to the execution, get the circus
No,
out.
I mean, some of the, oh my gosh, some of the, yeah.
Anyways.
Okay. Should not reveal my my sort of sordid desire for public executions, not because of the public execution, because of the incredible speeches that history has left of people just going to their death with things to say.
Laying it all on the line.
Oh my gosh, it's amazing. But yeah, that's not today. Now we kill people very secretly and quietly and after a long time.
In a bunker.
Yeah.
With like no one around.
Yeah, we promise it's not happening even as we can't stop doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the church, by providing mercy, this is Augustine's argument, is really showing the mercy of God in the same way that the state is showing the justice of God. And you can see with Augustine, the whole of society is supposed to be revealing who God is, instead of this idea of the God people kind of separately over and against a secular people where God isn't important.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we come to modernity and we look at the practices of the Middle Ages, I think the most basic thing we lose is real belief in God. So we have this idea that people could only ever believe if it were some means to another end. So when we look at sanctuary, the skepticism is that the criminal must just be doing it to get off. The people pursuing the criminal must just be obeying sanctuary because of the power of the church.
Yeah.
And the church, this is where it gets, especially when you read the history of the church grumbling so much about having to do sanctuary, it becomes a little implausible. But the theory of modernity seems to be that the church is doing it as a sort of proto-state. It's like flexing its nascent desire to really be the rulers and to have a sort of hand on the justice system and things like this.
So we're intercepting your criminals before they can go to your courts and all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just not the case.
No, it doesn't seem like it. But you can see the kind of backflips that moderns have to do and when there's a simple explanation, which is that everyone believed it and it was true. Like the simplest explanation is that the criminal, of course he wanted, relief from his crimes, but to go to the church is to admit wrong. And Augustine's point in this essay is that the penance that the priest applies to the criminal is a more sure way of securing his reformation than punishment. And this is, I think, what we have to remember today. Like whenever we look at sanctuary and think like, oh, how weird and quaint Christians, pretending that churches have like power or something. We have to look at our prison system and say, okay, sure, maybe that's the weirdest thing in the world, but what's a little bit weirder is locking up a incredible amount of people with not even the pretense of reformation anymore. We're just like, let's make an alternative city of criminals in which people become bad. We know they become bad through the process of prison, but let's keep doing it because there is no alternative.
Right.
That is a wildly, and I use this term pejoratively, religious belief, right?
I think that gets us to Foucault.
Why not?
Because it's really funny because you with Augustine you're seeing a kind of medieval sanctuary society where. And what Foucault, I think the first thing he draws out with delinquency is this kind of movement from offender to delinquent. like there's a further subjectification, because if you're just an offender, you're a citizen who's done something wrong, and then you receive a punishment, you go back to being just a citizen.
Yeah.
But the way that the prison system, what changes the whole thing is delinquency, or being a criminal.
Yeah, the kind of permanent identity that
as a felon, or
which you get both. I mean, and Foucault's not naive about this. You get it both as an actual categorization of the state. Like, you are, from now on, you have a record, it's on your record, you undergo certain forms of surveillance because of this from parole onwards, but also the people consenting to this kind of power structure, of course, psychologically, are consenting at the same time to view people who did a crime and did time nevertheless as still a criminal class. Mm-hmm. And I think, coming from Augustine, what you can see is, I mean, that's normal to us. Like, that's totally normal. But coming from the Augustine essay into this Foucault essay, I hope people get the sense that it is an invention of modernity. The permanent status of criminality, and then ultimately delinquency, which we'll talk about, is an invention of modernity and has a specific purpose. And this, again, goes back to the kind of punishments of the Middle Ages, where, you know, one of the things that they would do is, if someone committed a crime, one of the common penances in England, and I think it was elsewhere, but certainly in England, was a public shaming, essentially, where at the Sunday Mass, and potentially for multiple Sunday Masses, the criminal would wear a sort of alb, like a white alb, and hold a candle, usually be barefoot, and would walk in front of the procession, in front of the priests and the altar servers, or the clerks, and would then stand, and often that was it, and then other times they would stand on, I think, the left side of the altar, and hold the candle for the duration of the Mass. Now, imagine getting that kind of penance, that kind of punishment. It doesn't fit today. Every now and then something happens where it's really exciting, because you see the way that the common sense of the Middle Ages is just bubbling under the surface of this facade. Like, there's a great story in, I think it was the early 2000s, where an Irish judge was convicting a man of public drunkenness. He'd been in a few times. He'd been into jail a few times and come back into the court system. I mean, this is a typical case. Like, nothing's getting better, nothing's improving. And he gives the guy, as a punishment, he has to go on pilgrimage. So he gives him a pilgrimage to go on. You have to do this. Now, of course, this is like, this is early 2000s. No one's, I don't think, being really faithful. But the judge at least had this understanding that something needed to happen to this man that provided a before and after, that he was allowed to become something different than he was. And this man, he went on pilgrimage, and he did it as, like, he was like raising money to do it, because that's the only way we can think about these things, is like, well, I'm doing it for charity. So he's raising money, and he goes and he climbs up this mountain, I forget what it was, comes back, and he's just really reformed. I mean, he has a new spirit. He had a lot of time to think about it. Yeah. Well, the harshness of the medieval punishments, I think, always has to be, you always have to remind yourself that there was the real sense, and not all the time, but sin can interrupt this, obviously, but there is the real sense that you took your licks and then you were done. Yeah. Like a flogging or something. There's not like, you get flogged, the peace is restored. You don't get this like permanent status as criminal where you are treated by the authorities as if you are a continuous object of surveillance now. Now, you might become that in a sort of, happenstantial way, in the sense, like, if you are in fact always doing crimes, you are in fact always going to be suspected by law enforcement in whatever form it's taking within a society, of course. But the punishment itself was designed to put an end to things. It's like, no one wants, sorry, I have a lot of thoughts about this. But people have this idea that like even parents want to punish, but I don't think that's quite true. I mean, maybe in some like either very abstract or very crooked way, you could want to punish, but what parents really want is peace. And the punishment is often very necessary to procure the peace. But the idea that they want to punish their children is a little absurd. And what I find in looking at the Middle Ages and Sanctuary is a kind of extension of that reticence to punishment. But when you do punish, it's in such a way that you're getting back to the peace. You're, giving the guy what he deserves.
Yeah.
You're making restitution, and then you're moving on.
I think one of the markers of that would be, the reception of the person after they've done the penance or the crime or whatever back into the social group. So if he does the pilgrimage, comes back, it's like, all right, he's back. Maybe it's still a little disgraceful, and it's like, okay, well, that dude had a,
No, it's not magic. I'm not talking about magic here.
No, of course. And then, but, you get out of prison, you get like a phone call,
right,
and now you're just a felon for life. And also you've made a lot of connections with people in the prison because you put all the criminals together, and you're probably more rough and tumble than when you were outside on the streets or whatever it was.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like
anyone that I've met that's gone to prison has always said it made them worse. And what they really fear is the time immediately after prison, where, especially through being involved in prison gangs and such, they're immediately more entrenched in violence and the potential of crime than before. And then this is actually manifested in the parole system as well, where, prison bleeds out into society as a whole through this system and just through the totalizing nature of the prison system. It's like, Foucault speaks about this because what he says is, look, if you take reduction of crime as the marker of the success of the prison, then everyone would admit that the prisons have failed. Mm-hmm. If you take the reformation of the criminal as the way of judging whether prisons are good, everyone would say that prisons are bad. They do not reduce crime. They do not prevent criminals from becoming more criminal. I mean, in America, I think the rate at which people, the rate is something crazy. I shouldn't do a statistic here, but look it up. The rate of recidivism, so the rate at which people who've been to prison go back to prison, is astounding. It's very high. So Foucault says, but if you are looking at these two markers, you're looking at the wrong thing. The question of the success of the prison is not in the reformation of the criminal, nor is it in the reduction of crime. Those are sort of superficial, and I think he thinks lies. I think those are actually lies from governments that they tell themselves and others in order to have a system of prisons.
And don't you think it reinforces the classification of criminal by that? That's Foucault's part, I suppose, but by not reforming the criminal and by not reducing crime, it reinforces the idea in the social consciousness that there is just a people called criminal.
Yeah.
And they just do criminal things. Like, I'm thinking of, it makes me a normie, but like Batman, Dark Knight, where it's just kind of like, Harvey Dent wants to throw everyone in prison to solve it, and the mayor's like, look, this is just going to cause more problems because now the mob's going to be coming after you. But it's not that they kind of just accept the fact there's just going to be this group called criminals, and if you let them run amok, they'll take over the city.
Didn't you say that you've read Bentham on this?
Yeah, Bentham.
Who is he? Can you kind of introduce him?
Yeah, Jeremy Bentham. Man, I haven't.
Because doesn't Foucault deal with him?
Yes.
Yeah.
He has. So he's kind of known for like this kind of social utilitarian model, but with regards to the prison, he basically. He says that you're going to have a certain percentage of people who are too violent for good society, whether it's like 5 to 10% or something. So ideally, you would basically loan out to the economy the time that would have been lost by them being violent and, like messing up the economics. So the prison system's really a time-based way to keep the economy going without having those bad people in there.
Gotcha.
So then you say, well, this fits 5 years, this fits 10 years, and then, whatever, this is 20, and then this is life. But why do you put, like, it's not actually for the punishment of the crime, because it's like, how does stealing a car and then shooting somebody and then doing like all these other things equal time in prison? But it does equal time in prison if you're counting by how how much time can the economy recover from your bad deed?
So like it's
and like get a loan.
Time is set by lost GDP, basically.
Yeah, something like that. So, and I think that's the reason why it's the utility of keeping prisons going, because and people will talk about it like, you know, this area has more crime and then the economy's receding in that area and that stuff, and so we put more of them in prison. So anyways, that's the kind of Bentham angle to it.
Yeah, and you see this in, I'm forgetting, the commission that basically standardized prison sentences.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Basically, what we've done, at least in our country, which obviously is a even compared to other countries, is definitely an anomaly of a very prison happy country.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we did is we really took away power from the judiciary, and I should maybe say that in the sense that we took away the faculty of judgment from our justice system. So the way that we did this was in some ways really well motivated. There was this sense that, as is always the case within liberal societies, there's this great fear of personal corruption being irrational, and this great desire to set everything by constitution so that people can be prevented from corruption. Because our big claim, our big effort as liberal society is to have peace without virtue. So we can take bad people, and because they're constrained by law and constitution, we will have good results. This is the basis of capitalism. This is the basis of bureaucracy, is that we don't need virtue. We just need power to enforce order and peace. Okay. The way that translated for us in the judiciary system is we basically set times for crimes. So stealing gets you this much. If you were stealing and you had a gun on you, then you add a point, and that point translates to a different time. If you had a gun and you pulled it out, then that's another point. If you were motivated in this way, -3. You know what I mean? It's like it's a math puzzle.
It's so insane.
Well,
like I don't know. It's like it's just so crazy to me.
Well, I think what's fundamentally crazy about it is the arbitrariness of it. Like
Yes,
at some
right.
point, there is no particular reason. I mean, you can say, okay, I can see why you would get more for murder and less for theft, but why this much more or why this much less is not answerable. It's obviously a arbitrary decision of sovereign power. It's just this much because we had to pick something, and they did. Now, again, in some ways, this was well motivated because it was trying to get over irrationality in judgment, to say like, look, you can't give a guy this much because he did this because you're actually corrupt or you're a racist judge or you have some kind of thing which is making you, give excessive time in prison. But the net result hasn't been, I mean, people will talk about this obviously with like marijuana use, right, which has the crimes that involve it, they have certain codes they follow. The judge is no longer using judgment about, well, what was this person going through and what would be the best thing for his reformation and what would be the best for the society that he's offended. These aren't questions that he can ask or can't make judgments on the basis of, because he simply has to plug in the code.
Totally.
So you did this, you did X, this is the sentence you get. Now, after that, there's some like extrinsic, ways of lowering sentences, but in its most fundamental form, we don't need a judge, we need a computer, and so judges become extremely cynical.
Totally.
Because,
I was at Notre Dame, and I heard a talk by, actually he was a judge in Chicago for like a really long time, and he said exactly with that same commission that gave you exactly what you are to say, he just found that like if he wanted to be a robot as a judge, he could be a robot. But he said what I encountered in my practice as a judge was not legal entities with conflicting interests. It was just persons with their own, problems and whatever. And he said what I would typically do is I would, take the different parties, I would separate them, I'd have them come into like my conference room, still wearing all my garb and stuff, and just say, all right, what's your, complaint against the the defendant.
Yeah.
And just wait, just like listen. Yeah. And they vent it out, completely vent it out and all that stuff. He'd go to the other side, the prosecuting side, whatever, do the same thing. And then he comes back, and like usually they've come to some type of, understanding or agreement. Maybe they settle, something like that. And he's like, if I wanted to, I could just be like, well, the law says this, we've proven this, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
And the law encourages that. And there was a book he recommended, I just got it, called Masks of the Law, and just talks about that phenomenon for our legal system.
Well, I mean, what you describe is him taking up part of sanctuary. So part of sanctuary was that the priest met with the offended and the offender in order to help people arrive at a peaceful solution. I say solution, and I should be clear. That solution could be imprisonment, and that solution could be killing the dude. Like,
this isn't just like sometimes, we're forgiving all.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's hard because sometimes you talk like this, and there is obviously prison abolition movement that has muddied the waters in a lot of ways. By sometimes, not everyone, but some people have this like idea that you can't imprison people at all because
of like a human dignity argument.
Yeah, it's just like freedom is so special. And I just want to be clear, that's not what's being argued here. Mm-hmm. You can imprison someone. Yeah, why not? If I mean, I don't know. It's just funny. It's like we're so worried about things, and the moment you think about what they were doing to people in the Middle Ages, it just becomes kind of tame. Like,
see, when I think of a good prison, I think like those 1950s like Western prisons where it's just like some bars and you throw the guy in there.
Yeah.
I don't think of the huge state penitentiaries or something like that.
Well,
but
the state penitentiaries are built as these sort of like monuments to our shame over it all. They look. They're to make the criminal class a sort of invisibility to a respectable class. And it is what you would expect ultimately from a society that can't understand sanctuary, where once you get rid of the idea that there is in a society a sort of central point of peace, then all you have is war. And all you have is like the attempt to regulate coercion in such a manner that as much peace as possible is sort of eked out of things. What I was thinking about with sanctuary is just the fact that what does it mean to go to a church? Why was it the church that became the locus of sanctuary? And the most obvious reason is just that it was possible because the church was the one thing everyone was doing in society. So for instance, like when in the Middle Ages, heretics couldn't receive sanctuary because to be a heretic was de facto to not be participating in the one thing of society. It was to be participating in some other thing violently opposed to the society. And so the church was what you were at war with. I mean, that's just definitional, right?
Yeah.
But when you have a society that's pursuing a common good, you also have that common good take on a sort of incarnate form. For Christendom, this is the church. It is the realization of the good that we're all seeking. Like we're all seeking peace, and here in the church, we've found it. We're all seeking unity as brothers, and here in the church, it's realized. We're all seeking heaven, and here in the church, sacramentally, it's present in the Mass. So to go to the church isn't just to say, okay, I know I was wrong. It's also to say, I know I was wrong, and I want to show with my body its location, and what I do with my body, I want to show a will to be a part of the common thing. Mm-hmm. I'm on the team again. I'm on the same team. I know I left, but I'm on the same team again. And whenever you do that, mercy is a natural response. To see someone, I mean, you think about a parent with a child. Like if the child preemptively comes and says, I did this fault, but I am on the same side as you. I want your mercy. The reason mercy is natural is because the child has, in a sense, already attained the end that punishment would seek, namely an end to the disruption, a restoring of the peace, and everyone being back on the same page together. And so when the child achieves that for himself, the parent would be kind of It'd be a little bit odd if you just like went through some violent spanking to be like, sorry, the law's the law, and you got 16 spankings from, that's what the code said. Yeah. So there's a logic to it, and that logic is lost when a society doesn't have anything in common, which is where we're at. There's no goal to liberal societies. In fact, they're proudly premised on the idea that there's no point to human life, and so you get to figure it out yourself. This is supposed to be the great pleasure that we all take in being liberals. In fact, it's what it makes everyone miserable and insane, and also makes things so merciless, because there is no way of signifying that I'm back on the team after breaking with it if there's no team. Mm-hmm. Well, what do? You're going to go to a Lutheran church and like tug on the hem of the pastor there? I mean, it doesn't signify anything. It's like, that's just a arbitrary private opinion church. And the fact that you're there means nothing to the whole society. So yeah, the cops are going to bust in and break your thumbs. Like, of course. So the Middle Ages, we look to not as like, we can somehow just go back to that. I know sometimes we get accused of that, but because when a society is about the work of Christianity as its common life, which is what the church is. I mean, it is the socialness of man taking concrete form. Then new politics are really possible.
Yes.
Sanctuary is something that was new to the world. It was new to the world, and it is now strange to the world, because it's something that only comes about when you're all doing one thing.
It also solves the problem of, well, it alleviates some of the fugitive problem. Like if you commit a crime, like the police just presume you're gonna flee, like, and we're gonna chase him, and like it may end up we shoot you. You're definitely gonna get like thrown with your face on the ground. But imagine if, like, you commit a crime and you like walk into the police department.
Yeah,
I don't know. Like,
no,
but
it's
sanctuary
so
would be
it's
awesome.
So
it's like, okay, well, you got a place to go if you don't want to, keep trying to flee.
Yeah, and it actually made the legal system really work very well, which is why even as the state started to be built up in royal regimes, they used sanctuary. They weren't like opposed to sanctuary. That's another myth that like nascent states didn't like sanctuary because they didn't like the church. It's so dumb. Really, they especially in England, they maintained sanctuary law as a way of doing criminal justice. One of the most obvious things, is where the criminals are going. And sanctuary churches depended almost entirely on the villages that surrounded them participating in the logic of sanctuary and being offended if sanctuary was violated. So when a criminal got into the church, you would often find that the villagers would stand in front of the door, not because they liked the criminal, but because they loved the church. Wow. And so then the pursuers would actually be beaten off, usually not by like a organized police force or the priests, heavens, but by the villagers who are defending sanctuary. So there's a really great paper, which I'll try to link in the comments, that talks about the way that sanctuary was efficacious precisely through sincerity. You don't get it without sincerity. Anyways, we spent a long time on this. Yeah. Delinquency, though, Foucault gives his whole take on this and comes up with the basic idea that the prison system doesn't succeed if you're looking for it to reduce or reform crimes and criminals, but it succeeds if you're looking for it to produce a certain class, which gives the state a great power in surveilling the entire society. Because if you can have people come and become registered as criminals, as delinquents, if you can set up forms of always surveilling them, then you have spies. You basically have a class of spies who are going to go back to other criminals, and so you can use them. You also have spies for any kind of revolutionary activity, because everyone knows, especially states at this point, that there's a link between the various insurrectional threats and revolutionary or communist or other type threats that a state has. And so by having delinquents as a perpetual class that's in contact with the police at all times, then you also have the ability to kind of break open any kind of solidarity movements by assuming that they're going to have the delinquents in their midst. Those people are going to be able to serve as spies. Yeah. And they also, this is one of the points he makes, it sets the lower class against itself. So you basically ensure that there will be people who are never forgiven, and that they become an alternative class within the lower class. Because let's be honest, like, we're not talking about rich people here. We're talking about poor people, which you can imagine the situation, because I think it still exists today. I don't think this is like foreign. It's just that you basically establish like the good poor and the bad poor. And then this enables you to always break any possible solidarity within a potentially oppressed poor class. So this is obviously very important within early capitalism, that as long as you can tell, the guys trying to organize against capital that in this scenario, this guy's, a dirty criminal, you can break solidarity. And this was, in fact, what was done. Foucault brings up a lot of good examples. And so in this way, he says the prison succeeds. It succeeds as... Oh, and then the other big thing, which we've discussed in the tyranny podcasts, is that the creation of a delinquent class is always a kind of gun held at the head of the middle class as the thing that can happen if you don't stay in line. So instead of this movement in which someone commits a crime, then is punished for it, and then is brought back into society, you have a constantly monitored and despised class of people who will always be felons, always be criminals, which becomes the way that a middle class that's stripped of any nobility or any kind of values differentiates itself as the normal people.
They could be people. Walter White.
Yeah. Yeah.
They could go from middle class, Albuquerque.
Yeah. So that's what Foucault argues, and I think it's to read those two essays works really well, and then it also, I think, works really well with what follows it, which we had a wonderful submission from a deputy sheriff who asked us to change his name for reasons of privacy, but who wrote a great reflection on just being a cop.
Oh, I loved it. Yeah.
Some of the stuff he's run into, and it's a little dark. It's a little bit depressing, because his basic thesis, and I think everyone would agree with it, is that order is breaking down. There isn't a lot of respect for law as such. The justice system is prey to a sort of apathy. It does not know how to solve the problems it has. Homelessness and drug use have made the kind of categories of, good cop versus bad criminal into this very ambiguous police officer as management of society's suicide sort of thing, which is bleak, and he felt the bleakness. But his ultimate conclusion, though, is the title of the essay: "The Police Won't Save Us."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very bleak, because he gets to the very end of it. He's talking about the conservative response is just, let's up the police. More funding will solve the criminal problems, and it's the Democrats in California and New York, or who are, he doesn't say that, but, who are keeping the police down, defund the police, saying that they're all racist, which he points out is a lot of departments just aren't getting staffed, because who wants to be a cop right now? But, he says, I really like this line of this: in the short term, an infusion of funding and support into the criminal justice system may be prudential in some contexts, but that would only be putting a very expensive bandage on a festering wound. It may look tidier and smell less offensive, but it's sure as hell not healed.
Yeah.
And, this kind of response that we have to up it, more, okay, do you have a lot of homeless and drug use in your area, and there's petty crime and all this stuff, and stores getting robbed or whatever? Is the response just to universally we just increase police and then things will be solved? And his answer is no, it doesn't. It still still doesn't work. Well, so we have to have societal change first in order to. He gives 3 categories to that. I don't know if you had a comment first, but
just that it's an untenable situation to solve at the level of statecraft, which is what you're saying. And that's the answer we don't want to hear. Like, we want to hear that with the right expenditure of money by powers, we will fix it. Mm-hmm. And so for the conservatives, it's like, well, let's spend money in order to expand prison capacity, change policy so that crime is punished like that, and increase enforcement, namely the police. And what we will then get is all of this bad stuff that's obviously increasing will get solved through the prison. Problem, namely that the prisons don't, it would be more effective to kill everyone who commits a crime, because prisons don't actually make people less criminal. And so unless we're committed to, like, that is the thing about prisons, like, you can't do it unless you commit entirely. Which at that point you might as well kill all criminals, and then there's something. Oh, you
have like what was it, Duterte in the Philippines? It was like, if you have any drugs, the police can just execute you on the spot.
Yeah, which of course,
and it's like it's horrible,
right?
You know, but
in a way, it's more logical. It's much more logical, because what we do is we say, okay, we want to solve this problem, but we're bourgeois enough not to want to go to war. And so what we say is, well, let's put them in the place where the problem gets solved through the use of money, but that place fails. It creates worse criminals. It hardens criminals, and we know this. And so so that doesn't work. And then the alternative is this, like, just totally brain slurried leftist thing where it's just like, well, there's no problem here. You know, like, let's just let people do stuff. What's everyone's so mad about?
Brain slurry is way too accurate. But yeah,
it's just like, it's just unbelievable. That now, not everyone's that dumb. I get it, but
all the people who run San Francisco probably
it got dumb. Pretty dumb for a while, where there was just this idea that somehow crime is actually caused by its punishment. And that if we just got rid of policing and punishing, it's like this idea that sin isn't real, and that sin is made up to control people. And so if we just let everyone go, then sin won't happen. It won't affect people. There's something there, because people are glimpsing the kind of closed circuit of crime and punishment that characterizes modernity. They're glimpsing this lack of solution and this production of delinquency as characteristic of our society. But because they're not willing to become Christian, they have no framework but to say, okay, I'm just gonna do the opposite of the coin. If the conservative is the one who says, well, let's just put them all in jail, then the liberal is increasingly becoming the one who just says, like, let's just let people do what they want and not have any enforcement mechanisms besides sending, like, social workers to your house to, you know, talk with you, which is, of course, we say the most Foucaultian thing that could have happened was like, we can do this through therapy.
Oh, Foucault would not have liked that. So you're saying the conservatives on one side want to use vengeance and too much, and then the lefties on the other side want to just pardon and not even see a thing as an offense.
Yeah.
So maybe we're thinking about sanctuary again.
No, totally. Yeah.
He gives a few. He says we start to break down these controls. We start to kind of reincorporate some informal social controls that aren't like police and legal apparatuses, but what he calls belonging, authority, and expectations. And the point being is that, well, if people belong to a family, to a group, to, you know, different people, they're the ones that can really help people not go down certain paths, or let's say it's, you know, drug abuse or something. They're often the best people to help you get out of that, right? Because it's not mainly a criminal offense, but a, you know, like physiological and psychological thing that led you to that point. Then it becomes, you know, criminal as well. But if you belong to somebody, they're like, we got to get you out of this. We got to get you help.
And he brings up belonging because he says, you know, there wasn't police before the 19th century, which is really important to remember. Like the thing that we think of as police. Now there was law enforcement in different ways, but the thing we think of as like a police force that is there to take care of things when they become bad is, and uniformed and representative of the state, all that stuff. That's very modern. It's invented in London and kind of went out from there. And he's asking the obvious question, like, how did we do it before? So when he brings up belonging, the point is that, and we brought this up many different times in many different ways with New Polity, but the police force is a sort of concentration and a corruption of a power that every human person has, which is to render the wicked impotent and to protect and defend the weak. This is not just a power we have, but it's actually an obligation we have. So when we have power, we have to use it in this way, namely to render the wicked impotent and to defend the weak. That's policing. The idea that you can take that from people, essentially make it illegal for people to police themselves at the level of that this author's talking about, at the level of belonging. And to make it a professional service provided by trained professionals. That is the fundamental sort of modern error, it seems to me, when it comes to criminal justice, is that we can have the goods without the work. And everyone knows this at some level. It's like, you read in the news these like crazy stories of moms calling the cops on their 13-year-old because the 13-year-old like lied to them or like, broke their car or something. And we roughly describe this in our category as like, this is the breakdown of the family. But it's also the logical conclusion of giving up on virtue as something necessary for the peace. Like you just don't get to have a peaceful society if you do not have virtuous, which means strong, people. If you're not willing to police a given situation, you are the source of the professional police, because that is the way that we abdicate our own power and end up, just calling the professionals to deal with this thing called sin.
Yeah.
Now, I don't mean that there's like not a crisis, as if we could all just say like fentanyl, for instance, it does make things difficult. But the point of the author's The Police Won't Save Us is that there is no solution. Like, this is going to be a really bad time for society because we have progressively upped the sort of violence that we're capable of within society, and progressively degraded the social controls, he calls them, that kept things in check prior to this. And we're now realizing that solutions can't be just bought and paid for. And so what he's arguing is very simple. We need to be Christian. We need to have mass conversion, all become virtuous, right? Which is like saying, let's do the thing that we all know we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But as you might have noticed, it's difficult.
Yeah.
So it's very pessimistic in that regard, but it's also, I think, very realistic. Like you don't solve society just by the introduction of more guns. You have to become good. You have to become the thing you're describing as the end goal, which is peaceful and good and strong and virtuous and all these things. It's so obvious. I mean, I feel like sappy saying it sometimes.
Yeah, it's like,
I'm always like, you got to be a good person. How are you going to do this without being a good person? But I think it's true, and it's nice to hear someone on the ground there who is working as a police officer, but is seeing the same sort of thing, that without virtue, we're not going to spend our way out of crime.
Mm-hmm. So we got a few academic essays. We also have an essay by Matthew Del Santo, The Analogy of Kingship. Subtitle, Mystagogy of the Coronation of Charles III. Yeah. Very pro-monarchy, we should say.
Yeah.
And even talking about it as kind of a Dionysian divine names, like ascending kind of mystagogical analysis of this coronation.
It is very beautiful. Yeah. And I think he really points out what it's going to be. We're going to be doing a little more of. We're publishing an article by Andrew Willard-Jones about the meaning of royal power in Thomas Aquinas, because this unfortunately kind of gets usurped sometimes by the monarchists, by which I mean the kind of romantic view that all our problems would be solved if we just had kings. But by kings, people aren't clear what they mean. So when they say that, you're kind of on your guard, because they might mean like an absolutist king, or they might just mean like King George and the American Revolution shouldn't have happened, kind of thing. Yeah. So it's unclear, and it's often very romantic, and it's often the kind of like audible sigh of someone who's just tired of really thinking about politics, and so it's just like, well, put someone in charge who's good.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. So Andrew's writing about that royal power as a social phenomenon. So like something that when a people are a certain way, they become capable of royal power, of a society that is living under royalty. Mm-hmm. And he makes the obvious point that not just any people can be a people ruled by a king, that it's a kind of people who become ruled by a king. It's a kind of people who become ruled by a tyrant. This is the classical philosophical tradition. And so what I see in Del Santo is in some ways, I mean, it's very beautiful how the kingship of Christ is present in the rule, in the kind of the liturgy of coronation in England. But at the same time, it's also extremely apparent that this is a kind of echo of a reality that isn't present right now. Mm-hmm. You know, like,
we can't think of a king without him being an authoritarian with an administrative state.
Right.
Like, what would a king even look like today? If this actually kind of moves me to the Pagan Laws and the People of God, where he's talking about, the different, what he calls like the natural estates of king or magistrate, kind of the people generally, and, whatever the intermediary is. I can't remember the third one. Yeah, kings, priests, lords. There's different ways of saying it. Magistrate, assembly, council, cabinet. But that he's taking on Vermeule. I'm taking on Deneen later. But that the administrative state can take all the goods of the three classes and just elevate it. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, like, we only view the king as being like a guy who takes over the administrative state and rules it purely by himself. Right. And what Matthew Scarance is arguing is that precisely because paganism ends up having one of the classes take more power than the other, that they start to arrogate all of that to themselves and become either the god emperor or kind of super corrupt oligarchy or a kind of mass democracy. And so it's precisely Christianity that can take away all the excesses of the classes and make them work together well.
Yeah.
And make the possibility for monarchy come back to it.
Yeah, he says somewhere near the end of his essay, he describes the difference between the royal power and the sort of Christian order of things, which he does see as a fulfillment of a certain striving within paganism. He sees the difference as a real distribution of power, where because there is an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of God as part of the social order, the various divisions of power have to be power ruling under God and never power ruling as God. And that seems about right. But he also points out that where this gets changed is when that distribution turns to administration. So if distribution is like the giving of real authority to other people beyond the king, beyond the sovereign, administration is the idea that other people are basically the way that the will of the sovereign, the will of the sort of one central power, whatever that be, becomes injected into society. And so instead of people with their own authority, you have people who are basically employees of a sovereign regime.
Yeah.
And this he locates as the way that Christendom corrupts, the way that it becomes.
And it's the loss of agency on the the bureaucrat as well. He's just like, whatever the policy is.
Yeah, which is obviously what we experience. He says, the failures of the administrative state are manifold and they are ubiquitous in modern life. Who among us has not felt the cold, crude, and omnipresent hand of the administrative state in all the major decisions of life? The state invades not only the personal lives of its subjects, but the lives of communities, as when in France, under the guise of rationalization, it abolished the provinces that had been formed by historical use and natural geography in favor of a blatantly artificial grid of departments. In Italy, under the fascist regime, all emigration from the country was forbidden in an effort to expand the state economy. Instead, this resulted in the complete and devastating implosion of Italy's economy. Not content with dictating the lives of persons and countries, the administrative state even attempts to shape nature itself in its own image. In the 17th century, for instance, the Prussian state sought the rational organization of forests, to plot them into separate ranks, to divide elm from oak for the purposes of increased production efficiency and tax revenue. The illusion of order gradually gave way over the generations to the chaos of Waldsterben, forest death, as the delicate balance of natural ecology revenged itself on the state that had so brutally cast it aside. And he gives a few other examples. But the basic point is that this thing that we call the state is often characterized as just another word for governance. And so when people critique the state, as he does too, one of the ways of getting rid of that critique is just imagining that they're critiquing government as such, that they're critiquing rule, that they're critiquing lordship, that they're critiquing any kind of order to society, and so they're really just anarchists or something like that. What Scarens points out is that the Christian political orders is characterized by a certain humility at every level of authority, and it's this humility that the state oversteps and sort of draws the sort of idea that order actually proceeds from the state and isn't something that the state, the government, serves or maintains. Yes. And that fundamental shift is, it's easy to do. I think everyone can become tyrannical in their own lives in that way, to see ourselves instead of as stewards of the lives that are given to us, of the peace that's present to us. We can see ourselves as the source of it. But as those examples point out, the attempt to provide order from above, to act sort of godly in that way, usually ends up destroying the peace that it would produce. And so I think that it's very important to realize, because there's sometimes, Catholics especially, but just people in general will say things about the state that I guess can be kind of sound offensive if you have this idea that this state is somehow a natural institution of governance. So I think of the time that J.R. Tolkien said that what did he say? Anyone who uses the word state should be given an opportunity to repent, and if they don't, they will be executed immediately. He was describing his sort of political philosophy. And then I was thinking also of Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I'm not saying everything he says is right, but it is certainly indicative of the non-natural character of this thing we call state, that even a guy like Nietzsche is looking at it and is just repulsed. So I was going to read something.
The New Idol.
The New Idol from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He's speaking in the language of the state. So this is something the state, which he calls the monster, says. Because he begins this whole thing where he says, "State? What is that? Well then, lend me your ears now, for I shall say my words about the death of peoples. State is the name of the coldest of all cold monsters. It even lies coldly, and this lie crawls out of its mouth. I, the state, am the people. Okay, so that's the state. He's the cold monster.
Who claims to be the people.
Yeah. On earth there is nothing greater than I. The ordaining finger of God am I. Thus roars the monster. And not only the long-eared and the short-sighted sink to their knees. Oh, even to you, you great souls, it whispers its dark lies. Unfortunately, it detects the rich hearts who gladly squander themselves. Yes, it also detects you, you vanquishers of the old God. You grew weary in battle, and now your weariness still serves the new idol. It wants to gather heroes and honorable men around itself, this new idol. Gladly it suns itself in the sunshine of your good consciences, the cold monster. It wants to give you everything, if you worship it, the new idol. Thus it buys the shining of your virtue and the look in your proud eyes. Yeah.
So good.
So, just to say that,
it takes all the energy of politics and puts it into this just like mechanism of bureaucracy and violence.
Yeah.
And you can't, like Nietzsche's pointing out, it doesn't actually, you can't do what you want with the state. Like even if you had the state, if you had all the state powers, you wouldn't be able to do the things because it only has a kind of negative function. It just, it takes all the power of, for Nietzsche, all the power of the people who want to move beyond good and evil and become, Ubermensch for him. And it moves them into just a state bureaucracy, and then all of a sudden they're just lame.
Yeah.
Like I'm writing now on Nietzsche, and I think people miss so much that Nietzsche's not a nihilist. He's not even what you would really call a moral relativist. He has a vision and he has a goal. And his version of politics is not just pure statehood. It really is for the coming back of men of virtue and philosophy and art and the higher men and these type of things. But I think that just demonstrates it there that the kind of like secular acceptance of Nietzsche on the left and the right oftentimes will make him either as a kind of genealogist of the state, in which he's trying to show that it's just power games and then you use it to, overthrow state power. Or on the right, it's like, well, this is what strength is and we need a strong state. But as you pointed out here, like, he's not a statist.
No, not at all.
But anyways.
So Scarence just did a wonderful job, a wonderful history here. And he also has some great insight into the corruption and fall, and also what made the Austro-Hungarian Empire unique. And he, in this essay, takes to task the idea that it was sort of an inventor of bureaucracy as a form, and says that it was not. It was actually a continuance of the medieval idea of the civil servant that, yes, over time up to about World War I, did corrupt into a bureaucracy, and that was precisely its downfall. So yeah, read it, check it out, you'll like it. And then we've got James Wood, who's given us the good news on de Lubac, which I'm very grateful for him because, not being a particularly intelligent theologian, I sometimes say things that to me come more through just my immediate engagement with scriptures or just vibes. And then someone says, yeah, de Lubac said that. And then I go to de Lubac, and indeed he did. And so there's a, it's great that it's great that there's someone doing the work. And this essay is really just laying out de Lubac's historically embedded argument with integralism and his attempt to kind of carve out an answer to the question of the church and state, and to locate that de Lubac's thought in the context of the controversies concerning Action Française, which we could say a lot about. I think what most offended de Lubac, what becomes clear in this essay, is this idea that Catholics had in France, that they could basically partner up with atheistic political movements that appeared very powerful at the time. And the defense being something to the effect of that this is actually the real structure of reality, that there is a difference between like theological facts and political facts, that there is a realm of pure nature in which pragmatic considerations are sufficient. It's a very old, at this point, kind of, it seems silly. I think it seems silly, this idea that there's like a, well, Christianity involves this sphere, but then there's this natural sphere that Christianity doesn't really involve. And so we can support a kind of atheistic, power-hungry regime here because it's going to fight for us as a church as this other thing. And Lubac says this is a constant temptation for the church to say, oh, I'm losing power, I'm losing influence, and so I'm going to ride on the coattails of some political regime and gain it that way. Lubac, Dostoevsky says the same thing in Grand Inquisitor, but Lubac thinks this lowers not just the church but the state, because it basically, by separating the state out and saying like, well, it's just about this is just the pragmatic business. It gets rid of anything sacred about its role, about the temporal power.
Oh, right. It just becomes an accessory to...
Yeah, so it's very... I mean, a lot of people think that because they've accepted secularization, that there's nothing sacred about government. And so then the church is this sort of spiritual entity that stands over and against something that is temporal. But I mean, there's just like nothing about the incarnation that should lead us to think that the temporal itself is not also part of the, I mean, like what Andrew Jones calls the business of the peace and the faith, that these are ultimately about one thing, one pursuit of heavenly perfection. And so that there's no real like complete parsing them off from each other, even as Lubac wants to say they are in fact different. And at some point, James Wood uses the analogy of man and woman, and I thought that was very helpful to think of spiritual and temporal, not as man and the woman, because obviously when you do that, you're immediately going to decide which one is which. And depending on your view, it's going to become sexist inevitably. But to say, here's another thing where there's two things that are different, and both about the same business. They're one thing and they're two things. And this is a great mystery, and it's great to see in Lubac as a kind of guiding light. But also, I think, Lubac was pretty constrained, it seems, in reading this essay by his time. We all are. So he really felt like he had to defend the church, seems to me, as like, don't worry, the church isn't going to do any fascist stuff. Which, granted, during Lubac's time was a concern. And so you end up with his politics sort of being like, I promise this is all just going to be the influence of conscience. That's the only way the church is involved in things, which is, you look at the Middle Ages, it's like, well, unless you have a really broad view of conscience, that doesn't quite seem to follow with the way the church, at least historically, has governed people, and so it doesn't quite solve our problems. I don't think anything about this essay should make us think like in Lubac we have our answer. We
figured it all out. Yeah, no,
that's how to be church.
He's just saying
that's how to be state.
It's not counter polis and it's not integralism.
Yeah,
which he takes as kind of being the two that Potter Waldstein in the diarchy, Gelasian diarchy. It basically says either you're going to have this kind of counter polis where you're like a Habermasian and you're like a peace lover and this stuff, and there's no violence, therefore there's no. So you keep state and church separate, or you're a real integralist and you mesh them.
Yeah.
And Lubac saying, through this article, he's showing that Lubac he's not an Augustinian radical that Waldstein wants to put him into being.
Yeah.
It's much more, it's different than that. It's more serious.
Yeah.
So.
Well, read them, as always. The work is in the writing. So don't let us tell it to you. Yeah. Please subscribe to the magazine. I
should also mention your Overture was phenomenal for this. We didn't touch on to it, but we don't give away the Overture. All right. The Overture is worth I think it's worth the whole thing, and then you get a lot of extra good stuff. So,
we're doing some technology
stuff.
Which that's
some children are for,
Yeah. So this is a good point to make a few announcements. So buy the magazine, and what you'll get is some decent thoughts on the development of technology, the way that technology has usurped our understanding of history, the way that technology is a fate for us, and some stuff about child labor. And the reason I think you should read it is because we're having a conference on technology. This is, hopefully you've already heard, but if not, we'll say it again. Last weekend in May, whatever that is.
23rd to 25th.
That's right. We're going to be having
2024.
Just a really exciting conference. I'm more excited about this than I have been of any others. It's not just because we've got Matthew Crawford speaking, right? It's also because we've got DC Schindler speaking. And it's also because we are getting to debate such questions as, should we use prayer apps? Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be fantastic. It's going to be a great time.
Yeah.
So if you haven't yet, what's it? Newpolity.com?
Newpolity.com/events.
Events. Okay.
Yep. You can find it there.
All right. So come on over. We've got a lot of room this time. We're doing it in a new location if you've been here before, which should give us some more room. And the other essay I wrote in this was a review of Matthew Crawford's Why We Drive. This is the nicest I'll ever be about cars, I think. But I think those two taken together are a good sense of what we want to talk about at the conference, because in Why We Drive, Crawford's whole point is that when you take people out of the equation, when you start to serve technology instead of technology serving you, when you have when fear of death leads you to trust in mechanisms, inevitably you degrade yourself as a person because you are no longer developing the virtues by which you live from within. You start to live being protected from without. And for Matthew, this is like the definition of modern driving, where you're in a giant car that's ostensibly safe for you and is utilizing multiple computer systems, whether it's automatic lane correction, whether it's beeping at you when your seatbelt's not on, whether it's cruise control, all the way up to the sort of dream of the automated car. All of this eradicates the necessity for virtue and communion within a culture of driving. And the ultimate conclusion is very simple, which is that we only get better and better automated cars insofar as people get worse and worse. Like, you don't get to have one and the other.
There's still just one goal: you're driving to a place.
Yeah.
So if you're not doing it and the computer's doing it, you're probably worse at driving.
Totally.
So
I had good fun reviewing his book, and it's in there. We also have reviews of a book defending the novel as a form, which is great. That's Joshua Hren. Read that. It's marvelous. I don't know anyone besides Joshua Hren who can include as many quotes in one essay, and awesome quotes. They're always just like the best, most memorable quotes. That man is an encyclopedia. It's incredible.
Thanks.
Read that. And then you were in here, Alex. We can't forget. You did a review of Dr. Patrick Deneen's Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. Mm-hmm. And I think you were very kind to it. Deneen basically sets up a political vision about our country in which you can understand what's going on if you understand that there's a fundamental divide between the elite and the people. So this is sort of like post facto populism. He's, this has been happening for a while, obviously, the populist thing, and he's giving it a sort of a description that's more intellectual, more rigorous. And he has a lot of really insightful things to say. I thought the most insightful thing that I got from the book, and then again from your review, was the function of the university system as a sort of badge producing or elite producing institution.
Yeah. And Deneen often says, elite universities, like it plays both the function of, if you don't have the bachelor degree, you basically can't get this class of jobs. So there's that discrimination, but then there's also the, you have to be an elite university to make the connections to get into the elite things. And he, one section that was really good on this kind of meritocracy, and he quotes this book by Sandel, I think is his name, The Tyranny of Merit. And I went and read that book. It's very interesting. But it's the problem of meritocracy. It leads to what he'll call a cycle of self-congratulation that, we made it to Harvard, therefore we must be smarter because we did the test scores, therefore we must be better. And this leads to what, and he uses Charles Murray as well, leads to this more isolation of the classes, that it's not just because I ended up getting luckier and was, better at a test than this other guy. It's really because I'm better and I live in a better neighborhood and I'm like a better person than, the MAGA guy out in Ohio or something, Murray has this idea of the super zips, which is the zip codes that have like, millions and millions of dollars within their group to be in it, who are mostly Harvard, Yale, or, Princeton grads, outside DC and such. So Deneen is picking up on that.
Well, and also picking up on the way that once you have an elite manufacturing plant, then you have the ability to simply signify an allegiance to what's being taught in the university without being particularly intelligent.
Yeah, right.
So it's like, and this is part of the argument that I think is right about basically amoral language that woke stuff. Sorry, I want to find a better way to talk about it, but
it's the worst term.
Which is that, it is a product of university education. It's obviously a from above sort of situation. What it allows is for people to use that language, which they associate and only really receive thoroughly as a product of the elite university. Then the use of that language and that way of thinking becomes itself evidence of having gone to the university, which becomes a sort of circular loop of it. It's right because it came from the university, and the university teaches it because it's right. But what it really does is it signifies class difference. So the ability to manipulate that language comes at the price of a degree. And the ability to manipulate it really well comes from the cost of a very elite degree, a degree from elite university. And so you have, and none of this requires intelligence, right? Like it doesn't. I read a lot of papers, unfortunately, from kind of queer theory side of the world, and one of the things that they do is they pretend to think, where they take some issue or some text. Maybe it's the Bible. Maybe it's just something happening out there on YouTube. And what they do is they like run it through their filter of analysis, which just means translating it into the language they've received at the university without actually doing anything very different. So it's like, I'm going to read the book of Judith from a queer perspective. And then the thing they produce is this very like moralistic, preachy thing, which is really just a translation into an elite language of what is in fact common language.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then this signifies intelligence without being intelligence, because there's nothing smart about that. I mean, eventually you can get a computer to do it, but
you're just making Judith Butler, or not Judith, but Judith, the book of Judith. Oh,
I know, I get that confused too.
Yeah, she cut off the head of Holofernes. So, yeah, and okay, there's a lot I learned from it. Deneen's book, but I think it's kind of the deficiency of class analysis in a Machiavellian mode, that you can only really say our elite are good / bad, and we need a different elite. Like it's almost as if you can't really like demonstrate it. You just have to kind of say it a bunch of times. You'd be like, oh, well, the people, what they really want is common good conservatism, which is what Deneen sets up. And they want, the people desire an elite that acts for their good. It's like, but that's self-evident. If you're a people, you want an elite that acts for your good. Sustained systematic change is necessary instead of merely opposing the current elite, and that's what Trump was not able to do. So Deneen thinks that common good conservatism can kind of come about, but the means by which you do that is what he calls Machiavellian means, which is strong-armed populism or muscular populism, right? And but he's like kind of ambiguous. It's like, oh, well, if we pressure them with, like being angry, protest, bad votes, I don't, what exactly is this muscular populism? It's not violence in the streets for Deneen. He's very clear about that.
Yeah.
And that kind of ambiguity kind of leaves you like a little, what is this? What are you even trying to do with Machiavellian means? At least that's where I got to.
Yeah, because I can perceive of killing all the elite as being effective. But if we're going to convince all the elite to act in a certain way, then you have to ask, what is it that motivates them? And what Deneen says is that they're motivated by self-interest. They're a self-interested class, interested only in perpetuating their own power. But then the suggestion is that we need to speak into that. So we need to become efficacious according to that elite structure. Namely, we need to make it clear that it's in their self-interest to be conservative. And this, to me, is a complex way of admitting defeat, of saying, like, well, there's no Christian form to politics that's possible. All we can do is have an elite that, and this is where it gets weird, because like by virtue of being elite are the self-interested class, and then threaten them to enact conservative policy, conservative family policy. He gives a lot of different policy recommendations through our sort of Machiavellian means, which aren't violent. They're just basically challenge. They are threatening them with vote and money. I mean, that's all that it can be when you take violence off the table. Now, I say it's defeatist because it's basically saying that what we're not going to get is a elite who are actually serving the common good. So that's what was really interesting about the book, is at the end of the day, he kind of alludes every now and then to a process by which at some point genuinely good aristocrats will sort of emerge from this populist process who will have the common good in mind. But the way that we're supposed to get it is by just having self-interested elites who do not have the common good in mind pretend that they do when the common good people like threaten them.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem right. And the other thing that I thought your review pointed out very right is that correctly pointed out was the idea that the people are the good guys. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be the people, and B, I want to be the good guy. So there's something ideologically very motivating about this thesis. It's like he just comes out swinging and is like, look, if you're reading this book, granted the people aren't reading this book, it's elites, but if you're reading this book, you're a good guy and you're ruled by bad guys. And then you're in an action movie. It's like Marvel, movie number 32, and you're on the good team. But it's been my observation, and maybe this is checked out for you, that priest and people go together, and that if we have a progressive and wicked elite who worship the idea of a technologically produced future apart from tradition and apart from custom, and they want to constantly be shaking things up and ruining peaceful conservative communities, the only way that they have efficacy within a society is if that exists as a desire in the people. We're not like these sealed off units where you can have an elite guy who exists in contradistinction to the people of whom he is an elite. The very definition of an elite is that he provides for society at some level what they want.
Yes.
And maybe I'm just being cynical because, God's own Ohio just voted yes on issue 1 and have gone leftwards of Washington in terms of abortion. But what seems obvious to me is that there is a progressive populist thing that's been happening and will continue to happen, just as there's been a like the people are actually as divided, and if you've met them, they're sinful and very given to loving money more than God. Have you ever met them? Because that's what I've found.
Yeah.
And when you have that, you've got a reason that you have the elite that you do. That makes sense. But what he wants to posit is that we've had apparently for 100 years or so a elite that is the elite of a people and yet not of the people.
Yeah, totally. I think the populism thing's a bit weird to me because there's been a move. A friend once described the state to me as a game of whack-a-mole, but the state holds an enormous sledgehammer. It takes them a really long time to hit you with the sledgehammer. And in the same way, if you want a regime change, like I think these thinkers on more of the right have kind of given up on the populist side of things and more towards we're just going to speak to the DC elites. We're going to speak to the elites that we can to start to solidify some type of right-wing power that can, take over a few bureaucracies here and there and like kind of run Washington as new elites. And they're not woke. They understand their enemies, this type of thing. And I'm thinking of like Moldbug and Moldbug Yarvin and some of these other guys on the right. Their whole focus is populism sucks, democracy's terrible. We just need to go talk to the current elites, get them to reform their power and use it to what we want. And so Deneen kind of is trying to do both. He's trying to do like the people are good and conservative and we're going to just use that power. And also we need the elites to convert.
Yeah.
Because he has this whole thing of like, this will require a number of class traders on behalf of the elite. So he kind of wants to take like a kind of conservative MAGA populism, unite it with a kind of Yarvin monarchist elite new class thing. And I'm at least this is how I categorize it in my mind. And it just doesn't, at least for me, it didn't congeal. Like it didn't come into like a single plan.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, the people aren't as conservative as you are assuming they are. The elites are a lot stronger than can just have a muscular populism overthrow their whole thing.
Yeah.
Why would the elites decide to become this version of elite? Is it really in their self-interest to act on behalf of the people? Can they just make an appearance of it? So while I learned a lot from it, I think there's a lot of deficiencies in its kind of like main thrust.
Well, and I think the unfortunate part is that it just seems to be describing what we already have, which you bring up in the review, where it's described as like, okay, here's a sort of roadmap for the post-liberal future. Like we're going to do this and get from point A to point B. But when you really get to the depth of the description, it's like we are going to have protests and we're going to vote in such a way that an elite people who don't care about us and only care about money are going to nevertheless enact conservative policy. And it's like, that is what is happening.
Yeah.
That's what we have. The only difference is that sometimes, because, I think he's right to a certain extent that there isn't, he's right about the elite, not as the elite, but as our elite, the elite of this culture, this liberal culture. He's right that governance is done for self-interest.
100%, yeah.
With rare exceptions, and when people are those exceptions, they fight hard battles. So he's right to a certain extent, but what he's wrong about is the idea that this isn't just something that is as doable on the left as it is on the right, and in fact is often done on the left, as we've seen many, many times. And part of the concern, I think, that many people have is that when you argue that we should increase the scope of elite power for the sake of conservative ends without arguing for a concrete way in which the elite become Christian and devoted to the common good, then you expand the scope of state power without assuring us that it's always wielded in the same direction. Yeah. So, for instance, conservatives will do this, and I get it, and obviously I want my family to have as much money as possible, etc. But they'll describe this sort of increase in state power where it's all going to be for good ends, but the state is going to develop new bureaucracies for the sake of serving families and increasing population. It's like pro-natalist, and it's going to be pro-church, and we're going to expand, but for conservative ends, which is great if we are at the same time arguing that the elite who are expanding the scope of their power and doing all the things they are doing are in fact becoming good at the same time. But the whole premise of Deneen's argument is that they're self-interested and we can't really change that. And so we need to have a populist just threat against the elite. We need to just speak their language of self-interest and violence in order to get them to do what they want. Well, then we're just kicking the can down the road, or at least we're just waiting for the point at which our conservative protest becomes less efficacious than the liberal protest, which is also directed at their self-interest. But now you have a state that has expanded itself for the sake of conservative ends, being taken over by or being shifted in its own self-interest to destructive ends. Only now it's got more of a scope for it.
Yeah, right.
It's like, I mean, this always comes up with pro-natalist stuff, where it's like the kind of management of populations through abortion and contraception didn't begin with abortion and contraception. It began with pro-natalist intentions. I mean, if you look at the mercantilist period, like the interest in population obviously came up the moment that states looked at themselves as having a GDP, as having a workforce, as having as their power being synonymous with the amount of productivity and money that they could have. So then, obviously, reproduction of a workforce becomes an issue to them. Now, that's pro-natalist. They want lots of workers, right? And then that creates problems. But that same sort of power structure that could encourage and promote lots of workers can just as easily be turned, if it's not devoted to good beyond itself, can just as easily be turned to killing babies, which it in fact is. Yeah. Which just goes back to the point, which is like, I think this is already happening.
Yes.
I don't think this is normative. I think this is descriptive. I don't think this is what we ought to do. I think this is what's being done, and we're just hoping that, we'll have a couple more tide shifts in the conservative direction.
I honestly don't think I'd be as upset with the book if it wasn't called regime change.
Sure.
I think if you were talking about
how regimes kind of work around here.
Yeah, how regimes are working, But to call it regime change, to have this very strong language that we're going to do all these things, I think I don't know. It's just the insights that I find in the book, which are really good insights, get overshadowed by the introduction. When you're reading the introduction, okay, he really thinks he can do a regime change here. And then you get into the main chapters, you're like, this is awesome, this is really cool, he's describing this really well. And then it's like Machiavellian means and stuff, just a lot of the reviewers just mercilessly attacked it for that. But I think I think it's worth a read.
Yeah.
I think it definitely is. Although I don't think his prescription's going to work. So,
but who among us has the right prescription?
No idea.
Can't blame a guy for that.
Who's the real doctor?
So we have another magazine, and we're very grateful for your time as you let us review it. I have a sneaking suspicion that there might be people who listen to these reviews and think, well, now I don't have to get the magazine because I listened to the review. Absolutely not. You must get the magazine. You must subscribe. Without it, we fall apart. And furthermore, we can only really do a very partial and limited justice to what's in here. What I really like about this magazine actually is that the writing itself is really good. I mean, there's some really beautiful prose here. And so I would hope that for the sake of beauty, you would subscribe.
And it looks good.
Well, we try.
You know?
We try. All right, everyone.
Guys just falling off. You know?
Oh, yeah.
But, great.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another podcast. We will see you next time.